So as I touched on, I mean, as the films went, they tended to get more violent. They packed in more stunts. They became visually more ambitious. And in the same token, I suppose probably inevitably they became more camp and silly as well. This isn't really my cup of tea, but I understand why they did it, and actually I did enjoy elements of that. They really refreshed me as I was watching this. So I suppose probably people with different tastes will like Bond for totally different reasons. And what surprised me most about Bond, maybe, was the fact that so few of the Bonds actually add anything to the canon. We don't really learn anything new. One of them we learned that Bond used to be a naval officer. There's not really adding very much to the canon or to the franchise as a whole. At the heart of this really is the fact that the focus is completely on Bond, and yet there's so little in the way of character development for Bond. So most of the changes have come between the men themselves, as I've touched on. So all the different Bonds, even Lazenby's, was different to... So Lazenby's was a bit different to Connery's, and so on and so forth. He was less amused, he was more introspective. So, let's give Lazenby a bit of credit and say he did that on purpose. But most of the changes with Bond as a character have come as a consequence of changing the actor. So what I wanted to do now was go into, sort of what makes a good Bond film. I'm then going to go through and, I've done some very straightforward, sort of questions in, who's the best Bond, what's the best Bond film, who's the best Bond girl, all this sort of stuff that hopefully is going to be interesting. So, I'm going to start with what makes a good Bond film. So I think the most important thing with Bond films is you've got to get the actor who plays him right, because that will make or fail the film. And it is the most important, the key ingredient before you start to look at the script, the exciting action sequences, all of that stuff. And a lot of the early ones and even some of the later ones, they overly sped things up. When you watch Mad Max now, and they've overly sped everything up, so it looks absolutely ridiculous and sort of a bit sort of Benny Hill. Well, they do that a lot with these Bond films, and I think it's crucial if you're going to make a good Bond film not to have completely silly locations. So, they can go to Hawaii or something like that, that's fine. But it's, when they start having these crazy baddie bases, it all starts to get really silly. I think it's important that you get quite a zippy script with a good Bond film, with a relatively simple plot. So actually, we just zip along from A to B to C. We see some exciting action, we get some stuff done, and we understand at any given time how we get there. And in a number of the Bond films, really, you're sort of, how did they, where? So, interesting, I would have really liked to have seen a 30-something-year-old Sean Bean as Bond. I think it was really unfortunate. I think he'd have made a really, really good Bond. But, he was good fun and good value for money for Alex Trevelyan, the baddie in GoldenEye. I think it's important as well in a good Bond film to have some sort of palpable sense of loss, which is very rare in Bond films. So whether it's Bond's wife dying or HMS Devonshire being sunk, there has to be, a feeling that Bond is actually grieving and vengeful. He's sort of the vengeful hand of Britannia, coming in to smite the dodgy foreigner enemies. And when we get a plot, for example, there's Quantum of Solace, we've got the attempt to depose the Bolivian government, I think it was. That stuff is less interesting and less relevant. We're going to get rid of their water supply. It's not really relevant to Bond, and so we've got to have some bad stuff happening in order for Bond to step in. We've got to say, right, now's the time to bring Bond in. And I always enjoy a good revenge plot, and it's not exactly Bond, it doesn't exactly make for Lady Vengeance, does it? But when the baddie is a turncoat, I always really enjoy that as well. And I think, funnily enough, one of the most important things for Bond going forward is Bond should really hate himself. He should be unhappy, he should be desperately miserable, but, at the same time maintaining this veneer of being a normal human being, but really he's deep-rooted by all these really horrible things he's had to done, and, sort of haunted by all the ghosts. So what I'm going to do now then is I'm going to go through, I've got these categories that I've come up with watching the Bond films. the best gadget, the best Bond film, these kinds of things. So I'm just going to shoot through them now, and hopefully it'll be of some interest. So the first one I want to look at is best Bond gadget. So I think it's actually a pretty tricky category to start with. One of the things I noticed first was that at the beginning, Bond was frequently given a remarkably specific gadget. So, for example, he might be given a game of Buckaroo that if you put a certain place, piece in a certain place, it'll explode and take out one particular baddie. They're very, you could see it coming a mile off. When Q gives him his gadgets, you can say, okay, right, well, we'll see this later in the film. The exploding Parker pen from GoldenEye comes to mind as one of the sillier ones. So actually, I'm going to, there were so many silly things, and Pierce Brosnan's Bond also got the cloaking car, which was utterly ridiculous. So I'm going to skip over that category because it's all a bit silly. I mean, I'm sure you have your own ideas about it. So what was the best Bond film? Well, for me, it was Casino Royale. A lot of people have been saying it was Skyfall, but actually I think Casino Royale was a lot better film, and I think it was a lot more important film. Those aspects of Skyfall I think are really, really good, but overall Casino Royale is a better film. I think it was very relevant to 2006, which was very important. It was a tough reboot to do. We'd had the Bourne films, so they changed and increased people's expectations of what you'd get from a thriller like this. And we also had the absolute ridiculousness of the later Pierce Brosnan, when he's doing his ice chase scene, and it had to be Casino Royale, had to be right on the money, and it absolutely was. I think if Quantum of Solace was actually replaced with Casino Royale, I think it would have sunk the franchise for another 10 years. We'd probably still be waiting for a reboot. Who's the best baddie? For me, it was actually Skyfall. It was Javier Bardem's character. The scene in which he's introduced is just fantastic. We've got that long shot of the baddie walking towards the camera, and it's just a tremendous scene, and it's brilliantly acted and brilliantly done. I thought it was quite interesting. He had the abandoned Chinese island. I thought it was an interesting nod to things that had come previously in Bond films, and it was a baddie's lair. He was a bonkers character, and it really let Bardem chew the scenery, and he was absolutely fantastic fun. Honourable mentions for baddies. I really enjoyed the Christopher Lee's The Man with the Golden Gun. I thought he was excellent, and Dr. No as well. I thought he was quite good fun. Blofeld, obviously, there was an element of quantity, not quality, in places of we got some of Donald Pleasant's better stuff in there. Max Zorin, he was good fun, and I get the impression from Christopher Walken that he's just as bonkers in real life as his characters are. I thought the worst baddie was that Korean general bloke from Die Another Day. That was pretty shocking. I thought the most ridiculous baddie plot, I was thinking on this, it's actually pretty, I can't really call this one. There were so many moon and sea bases and layers and that kind of thing. The freshwater plot in Quantum of Solace was pretty low. Die Another Day, that was awful as well. And Moonraker probably. So there's some nominations. Oh well, I suppose the Fort Knox thing of irradiating the gold in Goldfinger. Yeah, that was probably it. It was fun, but it was a stupid plot. Let's go for Goldfinger. Best Bond car. I know absolutely nothing about cars, but I suppose probably the grey Aston Martin was the most iconic. Was it DB7? I probably made that up, but let's pretend it was. Honourable mentions, there was Timothy Dalton's submarine car, there was the tank in GoldenEye, and then also you had things like the Larders, they were fun. The VW Beetle, Tuk-Tuks. There was actually a scene in a film called On Bank called Tuk-Tuk Takedown, which reminded me of that. That was pretty ace. What other car-related information do I know? There's something called a DeLorean, which is probably the best car name ever. It sounds really cool. And that's pretty much all of my car-related knowledge. What was the worst car? That was probably the BMW hairdresser's car from Pierce Brosnan, I'd imagine. That was just pretty boring, and clearly they were in it for the money.